everybody, and welcome to another episode of Tapas Talkies. I'm Preeti Vikram, founder of Tapas, a progressive educational institution. I'm really excited to be in conversation with Rishikesh. Rishikesh, welcome to Tapas Talkies.
Thanks, Preeti. Pleasure to be here.
Rishikesh is a faculty with the School of Education at Azim Premji University. He also leads the Hub for Education Law and Policy located at the university. His research interests are in the domains of educational policies, assessments, and teacher education. He is from Namma, Bengaluru. He has done his schooling and his undergraduation from Bangalore. He went on to Jawaharlal Nehru University at New Delhi for his higher education, and he has specialized in ancient Indian history, which is so interesting. He currently teaches in the master's program at Azim Premji University. The courses he offers for students in the MA education program are related to history of education and educational assessments. Prior to his present role at the university, he has been an educational researcher for over 2 decades. Of this, he has spent more than a decade with Azim Premji Foundation, which allowed him to engage with education bureaucracy as well as teachers across more than a dozen states of India. Over the last couple of years, education policy related issues has formed the core of Rishikesh's work. He is on various government advisory committees on issues concerning education, particularly in his domicile state, that is Karnataka. His field activities are primarily through workshops on educational research, deliberations on issues related to teacher education, and a variety of engagements on education policy discussions. This element of practice and the engagement with theory in the classroom environment gives him the balance that he strives for between theory and practice in his work. He regularly writes for various publications on the issues and challenges related to school and higher education. And I was very fortunate to be on a panel with him, which was looking at the use of the online or the internet virtual platform for education right at the beginning of the pandemic last year. So a warm welcome to you, Rishikesh. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure, Preeti. Thank you.
Great. So we will be in conversation with Rishikesh, and primarily today we will be focusing on what assessments are like in the present education system, what should they be like, and what are his thoughts on how we can make those changes. So here's your first question, Rishikesh. What do you believe is the biggest drawback of the current assessment system in our schools, and particularly how does it impact the students and their learning?
Well, Preeti, I think this is something that we all are familiar with. Not just we educationists, but I think we as parents as well, because assessment is something that really comes into our homes, right? Now, when we look at as to what's happening with assessments today in schools, you will see that everything that happens in school is built around these assessments. So, it could be teachers calling up the parents to discuss about what's happened with regard to an assessment. It could be those mark sheets that children bring back home for which they need parents' signature, or it could be finally those board exams which then lists the ranking order of the students who are in fact leaving school after 15 years. But we go about ranking it. So when you look at as to what is currently happening with regard to assessment, I think we are stuck with the kind of issues we had 100 years ago. In fact, more than 100 years ago, around the 1900, Curzon came into India to manage the affairs of the British Empire here. And one of the things that he observed in terms of the education system that was in place was this enormous load that students had due to the assessments. And so he, in fact, set up a committee to talk about how assessments will have to be relooked and made progressive. Okay. Now, if he was talking about a century ago, making assessments progressive, and if we are still stuck in that same mode, you can imagine as to how regressive we have been in terms of what we are currently doing with regard to assessment. So technically speaking, what's happening in schools is that assessment of the learning is what we are focusing on across most schools, except a very few schools which invariably we call them as alternative, but I would say those should be the mainstream schools who have a very, very progressive and engaging ideas on assessment. Because fundamentally, what is assessment? It is about ensuring that the teachers as well as the students know as to where they are, what they already know, and what is it that they need to know to move forward in that learning journey, right? So the assessments will have to be designed in such a way that you would be taken down that path of filling the gaps sometimes if required, and more importantly building on the learning that you have. Now if you're only looking at what has been learned and what has been basically memorized, then you are not really charting that path ahead.
Right.
That path ahead can be charted only when you have assessment designed as assessment for learning, right? So that is the way forward. We unfortunately have very little of it. It should be the other way around. We should have a lot more of assessment for learning and very little of assessment of learning.
Fantastic. I think there are so many points there that really struck a chord with me. I heard another speaker give me say the statement where they said, if my great grandfather were to be alive today, but to come back today, the only thing I would have in common with him is probably our education system and the exams that he gave and I gave, right? So I think that's exactly what you said. From 100 years, we're stuck here, right? You're right. I think what we're doing today is the assessment of the memory, and it's not assessment of learning also, in fact. So I loved how you broke it down into assessment of learning, assessment for learning, and assessment as learning. And I'm just really happy to tell you that at Tapas, we are doing assessment as learning. I think one of the, especially in the primary years, we look at, if a child is making a mistake, if he knows it's a mistake, will he make it, right? If he knows that there is an error, why is he making it? So the purpose of assessment should be that they're able to look at what work they have done, understand where they've made a mistake, and correct themselves. And I think that is what you mean by assessment as learning, right? Have I got that correct?
Absolutely, yes.
Fantastic. So I think I'm so happy that we're already practicing that at Tapas.
Lovely. Just one thing, in fact, in what you just shared, there is assessment for learning also. So which is really good. Yeah, which is really good. I mean, that's really what would help the developmental journey.
Right. I think it has to inform the teacher about what lessons I need to plan next. When it comes down to it, today we are, like you said, following that textbook, and we're going in that linear manner that, okay, this is the chapter that comes next, this is the chapter that comes after. So this is how I'm going to do learning. So unless the teacher knows and she's part of this formative assessment that's going on every day, she would probably not know how to plan her lessons. So I think it's really wonderful that assessments should shape the way the classes, and it should shape the way that the lessons are planned. So I think that's a great takeaway. So we'll move to the next question, Rishikesh, which is, I think, very connected to what we've been speaking so far, that there have been some reforms in the past few years. And what do you feel is lacking or missing in these reforms? Or do you think they have enough teeth for us to kind of make the change in assessments that is required?
So as you would know, Preeti, I think, any reform in education will have to be holistic, right? And so when you're talking about reforms in assessment, it cannot be focused only on what changes that one brings about in assessment. As you would have seen in the National Education Policy 2020, it speaks about how important assessment reforms are if you are to bring about all the other reforms that NEP 2020 talks about. So teachers' autonomy is very crucial when we are talking about these kinds of formative assessments, such as assessment for learning or as learning, because the teacher is the one who will have to decide as to when is it that she is going to bring in the assessment component into her teaching learning process. It can't be dictated.
Right.
Unfortunately, what's happened with the reforms that we've had in recent times is even the changes have been dictated. Assessment for learning, which is a formative uh, design, is also dictated. Now, when this gets dictated, unfortunately, it doesn't really yield the kind of results that it is expected to. And then finally, you throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Which is what happened to CCE.
I love the word that you brought in, teacher autonomy. I think very often schools fail to recognize that the autonomy of the teacher is what will define how well the class functions. And it also makes sure that the assessments are not prescriptive. It's not something that, defines how the education system should be, but it's something which is more uh, which can be imbibed and changed and molded as per the individual needs, like you said, for the children. And so I really like what you said about giving teachers more autonomy to do this. But my question is, are the teachers equipped to take that? So it
Yeah.
isn't where teacher training comes in. And so then we'll have to look at the overhaul of the entire teacher training as well. So your comments on it.
So true. Yeah, so true. I mean, this is why I said that things will have to be looked at in a holistic manner. Though that comprehensive approach is very important. Um, so all these reforms will have to happen together, and that's precisely what NEP 2020 talks about. That in fact, even when it was submitted to the government, I remember that drafting committee said that if you are implementing NEP 2020, it can't be a piecemeal approach. It will all have to be taken together. Then we may prioritize, saying that this could be implemented now and another one 6 months later, another aspect next year. But then all of them will have to be planned for implementation. And as you rightly said, the teachers' professional development will have to include all these various changes that are being brought about, right? So that is, in fact, very important aspect wherein we build the capacity of teachers who would want this capacity to be built. Some may already have it. And that is again another change in the way that we go about teacher professional development. I mean, in fact, we call it teacher training, which in itself is a problematic term. I mean, you're not training there. I mean, it's about enhancing their professional capabilities, right? So in many different ways. I mean, it's not like how one goes about training someone who is an inferior being. I mean, at many points of time, when as a teacher educator you are with teachers, you have many teachers with far more experience than you, and many ideas that are better there with them. But then together, through discussions, through collaborations, through an engagement, is how you enable the further development of the professional person that you are engaging with. So in that, as always is said, right, when you are engaging that way, there is learning both ways. So even the teacher educator gets some kind of a development along with the teachers developing certain things.
Like what you mentioned, that it's not teacher training, because training means that it's you train a dog, you train something like that. So I really like that. So I'm going to change my own verbiage. I'm going to change it to professional development. Thank you for that. And I think what you said makes a lot of sense, because I think development only happens if there is intentionality, if the teacher feels that there has to be a change. And so you're right. When we talk of autonomy, it can't be just about how she's doing her lessons, but it's also about developing herself. So wonderful points there. Thank you so much. I'm really excited about the NEP, and I hope that it's implemented in the entire vision that it has been made in. And I do look forward to the kind of changes that we are at the threshold of. Um, this year, we've seen that the CBSE have cancelled 10th and 12th exams, and all the boards have cancelled those exams. And we've seen that we can still live. I mean, it's not the end of the world if there are no exams, right? But uh, what are the major concerns because these exams got cancelled, and what is the concerns that parents have about this? And can we take this as a primer for changing? Because now we've realized we've got a taste for it. Can we really take this and make sure that the changes happen?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Preeti. I think it's really the right time for bringing about assessment reforms. As you rightly said, the exams, particularly the 12th, have continuously now been off the table for 2 years, right? And so people have started to realize that life can indeed go on even without these very stressful board exams that have ruined, in fact, many children's lives because of expectations imposed by the parents, by the teachers, by the peers, right, by the whole system. And you would also know that suicide rates amongst adolescents in our country is among the highest in the world.
Yes.
Just because our numbers are so large, we don't really realize that. But then if we were a small country, if we had the similar kind of suicide rate, then we would have been hearing about suicides every day in the newspaper. That's how big it would have been. Even currently, the rates are so high that every day we lose tens of children. And the pattern is very clear. The closer to these high stress board exams, the increase in the number. And so these board exams, in fact, are the most regressive ones that is part of our system. It serves no purpose. If you really look at it, what purpose does it serve other than labeling a child and ranking a child? And what are these labels and ranks for, right? The ranks are used by the higher education institutions for admissions. So what does it mean? It is mean that the higher education institutions are lazy enough to just pick up the cream, right, and go away. Now, so there is absolutely no connect that anybody is making to what the board exams were supposed to be for, and what is it higher education institutions need to look for in students that they're enrolling.
So reflecting on what you just said, especially about the board exams and the need for them to score the 98s and the 99s and the 100% and all of that, I think the first thing that as a society we should do is stop having these big advertisements in newspapers saying the children of so and so institute got so and so percentages. Why are we celebrating that? That doesn't have, like you said, that doesn't have any bearing on what the child has really learned in those 15 years. It's just to know whether the child is capable enough, like you said, to leave school. And I think it's really interesting that we are talking about the percentages of the gross enrollment ratio, that percentage of children enrolling into higher education. When we look at it, if 75% of the students are not enrolling into higher education, is it not necessary for the school to equip them with the skills that is required immediately after their 12th? And so are we really doing that? And the focus on these board exams and these assessments have ensured that we don't have time to focus on these skills that is required for real life. I think so. Changing that one component of board exams and assessments will probably give a lot more value to the education that a child is getting in school. And I think that's something that we should be focusing on, right?
Very true. Completely agree.
Right. So when you say these kind of revolutionary things, these ideas which require a paradigm shift, what are the kind of what kind of reactions do you get from teachers and from parents alike? I mean, what's the general response when you come up with these ideas?
Yeah. So see, as you rightly said, right? I mean, as a society, we are so obsessed with marks and exams, and that is the biggest thing to break out of. So when schools are advertising ranks and things, we can't really blame, because parents are admitting based on what is it that schools would finally be able to do with their children at 10 or 12, right? So hence schools want to advertise as to this is what we've been able to do with children at 10, which basically means that their pedagogic approach, right, is hugely problematic in equipping children to be ready for a good higher education. because their pedagogic approach is teach to the test, right? So they start teaching to the test from the very young grades, right? And you would, I mean, since you are in that space, you would have seen it all around, and I'm sure that's why you probably even got into the early years, because it is, it's just unimaginable that a 5-year-old, 6-year-old, or even younger ones are being taught to do well in a test. So now that carries on, right? And it carries on, and it's all about teaching to the test. And as you rightly said, hence it's all about completing the syllabus, ensuring that all those questions behind the textbooks are mugged up, and doing all those uh, revision on the various mock tests and earlier question papers and things like that. So that's all that happens. Where is the thinking that is happening, right? Where is the higher ability skills that we speak of coming into the child? None of it, right? Higher order thinking skills are just not part of the whole school environment. So teaching to the test is something that we will have to get off, and for getting off that, we have to change the way assessments happen. And for the assessment, for it to change the way that one should actually have it, higher education institutions should have a separate assessment, which is looking at something like attributes, so that in the school you can't really prepare them for it by getting them to just focus on one subject, two subjects. It's overall how you develop a child. So these changes together will be able to then drive all the kinds of changes that we want.
I'm excited about the national curricular framework that's going to come up. I think that's such a welcome change, and I think that's the right timeline also that has been taken. That is from your 8th to the 12th. I'm sorry, 9th to the 12th. So if we change that block, I think the change will percolate down to the lower grades, and then help in the higher education as well. So I think we are excited about that, and thank you so much for bringing that to our notice. So I think I just have one more question about what has been the history of education in India, and does it look like we were doing better off back then? Does it look like we have to imbibe something from then to now? And just your thoughts on the history of Indian education.
See, if you look at India till the 1700s, right, we, along with China, were making up 50% of the world's GDP till 1700. So it's just been the last 300 years that we just completely collapsed. And of course, China has been able to rise faster than we did. So what did we do till 1700? And before 1700, if you look at, even if you take the Vedic times, which is dated to around 1000 BC, even by, well-known historians. So 1000 years, before Christ, and then another 1700 years since Christ. So we are talking about, nearly 3000 years. So what did we do in those 3000 years? When you look at, we were a knowledge generation society, right? And that is what took us to the top. And through that knowledge, we were able to generate so much of economic activity, which again, material and produces that were wanted around the world, that we were able to get 25% of the world's GDP. And along with China, it makes up to 50%. So being a knowledge generation society, or making ourselves into a knowledge generation society, did have a lot to do with the kind of society that we have. And not everything about this can be written up very positively. Yeah. But because, for instance, based, and particularly in the latter part of our history, of our ancient history, you did have the caste getting very concretized, right? And then whether I wanted it or not, I had to do something that my caste was ordained to do. Yeah? So if you leave out this, because this is a very, very negative aspect, that you're not allowing for people to actually go and do what they actually wanted, right? You had to think based on where your caste was in the society's societal hierarchy. But what did each of these castes do to ensure that they did better than the earlier generation, which is what was required to kind of keep moving up and keep being a knowledge generation society? So those are things that we could learn from our ancient history. So whatever be my caste, whatever be that caste of occupation, what did my community do to ensure that the next generation did better than them, right? One is attracting the children to that profession, right? Saying that this is what we are living by, and this is a profession that you will also get into. But then there is so much of excitement and wonder in what we do here. And if you come and apply your mind, you can do better, right? So that attraction to what you're learning is in itself a very, very important learning for us in terms of how do we do that with our children now in a secular education where, we teach them everything, right? How do we bring that attraction? And that very, very few people at the pre-primary level and the primary level are able to do this with our children, right? And so each one charted his or her own path to kind of reach the limits possible, right? So, and this was also possible because you had these smaller gurukuls, let's say, where children was, a smaller ratio, 1:5, 1:10, at best 1:20, right? And that is where learning happened. And so that's another important learning, that learnings happen in these smaller learning pools. They can't be these massive, 60 children to one teacher, which happens even in some of our most elite schools in Bangalore, right? 1:60 is the ratio that you see. I mean, you don't have to go to Gulbarga to figure this out. But even in elite schools in Bangalore, this is the kind of ratio. I mean, only thing that is possible here is standardized robot productions. So you get them all to dress up the same way, sing the national anthem with the same chorus, and then, come out of school with the same learning. It's tested by the standardized assessment, which will certify you that you are a robot. So, but it's just the opposite that happened in ancient India, wherein each one became his own, individual character. So even if you go to Mahabharata and look at as to what's happening in Dronacharya's Gurukul, right? You have these students, let's say pursuing different aspects, right? Of the Kshatriya communities, whatever, but different. I mean, one is looking at archery, another one is looking at wrestling, another one is looking at the mace wielding, right? But all of them are under Dronacharya. And each one is being allowed. So what is Dronacharya doing? It's not that Dronacharya is the greatest archer and the greatest wrestler. No, right? He's the facilitator. And as an adult, he's the one who's motivating these youngsters to go and achieve, the heights that is possible. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, those are, broadly the learnings that we can take, positive ones that we see in our Indian ancient history.
Brilliant. I think 2 points that really stood out to me. One is about the apprenticeship. It's about attracting the children into the profession. And I wonder how much we as educators are really attracting children into the education profession. And I think that's something that we have to really look at doing. But also, I think what you said makes sense in terms of the size of the educational institution. The larger it becomes, the more standardized and more sanitized it becomes. It's all sterile students being passed out, like Ken Robinson said, that year of passing, like year of manufacture that we are putting on them, and we are sending them out. But instead, I think there have to be more, like you mentioned right at the beginning of the conversation, the alternative schools like Tapas, for instance, that are coming up, which are micro, which are able to take that, the philosophy of education being for the purpose of developing these skills in children forward, and so are able to break the mold, are able to move away from the pressures of having to get 100% attendance and 100% marks and results and things like that. So there is no pressure, right? So, and I think that's where slowly but surely I do see that change has started, and I'm sure that it will continue to go forward as long as we fuel it enough. And that's where I believe that we educators have to come together as a community along with parents and have that buy-in. So fantastic. So Rishikesh, it has been a fantastic hour or so that we've been speaking, and I'm sure if allowed, you would be able to talk to us and we would be enthralled by you for a couple of more hours. But unfortunately, this is the time that we have. We would like to continue more conversations with you in future, so we will reach out to you. I hope that we're able to cause those small ripples of change, cause those much required ripples that will help us to bring about the transformation that we've discussed today.
Sure, Preeti, it was really my pleasure. I mean, the questions that you put across, and of course, coming from your experience of, whatever you all have done at Tapas. And so I wish Tapas all the best. And as you said, I mean, these could be small ripples, but then they are very, very critical ripples because these are finally the ones that are going to create those waves of reform. So, so Tapas has a very important role there. Don't consider yourself small. Every drop in the ocean matters, but I would consider Tapas, far more than just a few drops in the ocean. So please continue your good work, and wishing you the very best. I'm always there. You could reach out to me anytime.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much. It was a pleasure. It was lovely talking to you. Thank you.
Same here. Bye bye.
Bye.